I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Welcome to the Vietnam Veterans News Podcast. News of interest about Vietnam veterans from a Vietnam veteran. Now, here's your host, Mac Payne.
This is Mac Payne here with episode 1706 of the Vietnam Veteran News Podcast. News about the Vietnam War and the brave veterans who served there, as told to you by yours truly, a Vietnam veteran. In this episode, I'm going to introduce you again to Dr. Bob Rodrigues, an eminent history professor up there at Duquesne University in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, right there on the banks of the Monongahela River. In this episode, he's going to tell a story we would all probably prefer to forget and wish that it never happened. He's going to talk about when President Kennedy, back in 1963, gave the nod to start the mechanisms to eliminate the duly elected premier of South Vietnam. It's a sad story, but it's a story that must be told, and I can't think of anybody better to tell it than Dr. Rodrigues. So without any further ado, let's do it. Dr. Bob, the recorder's running and you've got the controls.
Okay. Hi, Mac. Glad to be back. Today, we're going to move on to a very interesting chapter in the Vietnam story, and that is the coup and assassination of the Ngo brothers in Vietnam. Let's just back up a moment. Ngo Dinh Diem had kept control of the nation from 1955 to 1963. And mostly he put it in the hands of his brothers and their in-laws. And promotions in the Arban were generally based on religion or loyalty rather than merit. So there was a lot of resentment, bubbling underneath the surface of Vietnam. In addition, Ngo Dinh knew the head of police and also the head of the secret police had been very, very vicious with any enemies. If you were an opposition candidate in an election, oftentimes you were accused of conspiring with the Viet Cong, and that was punishable by death. So there was a lot of, again, bubbling resentment because of the regime of Ngo Dinh Diem. Now, it really erupted in the spring of 63, and I indicated that last time with the Buddhist problem. The Buddhists came and they began to openly protest, especially when 8 Buddhists were killed in an attack on them by the army, which, by the way, no government denied and said the army was not theirs. It was actually the communists. So, this is what was going on. There was a lot of misinformation, etc. In August, we know that the Kennedy administration gave the nod to begin to look at removing Diem. And this is going to be, removal. And again, what is removal? Is removal to take a person and place them somewhere else, or is it to eliminate them? Okay, and that's where removal becomes a question mark. We know that Kennedy signaled to Diem that changes had to be made. He took out Diem's ambassador, Frederick Knowlton, who favored Diem, and replaced him with Henry Cabot Lodge. Now, there were a group of generals who signaled that they would overthrow Diem. And what they wanted to know is if they did this, would the United States continue to support South Vietnam? And this is the back and forth that went on between the CIA, a man named Lucien Conein, as well as Washington and in the American embassy and so on. But basically, they were given the green light to overthrow Diem. Now, the generals of the coup, there are really three. There were three main generals. And let me go through them. First of all was Duong Van Minh. It's I'll spell it Dungvanminh. He was known as Big Min. He was known as Big Min because there was another General Min in the Arvin Army, but also he was 6 foot tall. And for Vietnamese, that is tall. Most Vietnamese are much smaller, much more slightly built. He becomes the main figure, Duong Van Minh. The second is Tran Van Don, Tranvandon. He was kind of the moderate one. He was the one who was aghast that Diem was executed, and we'll talk about his role in a little bit. And then the third was Tan Nhat Din. That's TANNHATDINH. Now, Din had been a loyalist to Diem, and Diem thought that Din was on his side. So Din really broke with Diem and agreed to cooperate with the generals. Okay, so that was a lack of trust there, and of course he mislaid Diem's approval of him. So those are the three generals. Now, the generals were not real confident in American support, so what they did not tell the United States when the coup would occur. They didn't give them the date. They never allowed them to have the date. The Ngo brothers knew that a coup was coming. They knew as late as, say, October, about 25th, about a week before it all happened. They had people looking, spies everywhere, trying to unearth when this was going to happen so that they could stop it. Well, the coup started at 4 o'clock on November 4th. This is 4 in the afternoon. Around that time, this is where there was a concerted effort to surround the Gia Long Palace, and troops came marching down the street, and the Ngo brothers were in the palace, in the Gia Long Palace. But about 8 o'clock that night, they decided to leave the palace. And what had happened is they had built 3 underground tunnels. And these tunnels were, they could go down into any one of these 3 tunnels, and they would end up somewhere on the outskirts of where the palace was. So they were preparing. They knew that a coup would occur. So the Ngo brothers left at 8 o'clock. They emerged in a district of Cholon. That's Cholon. It's a district in Saigon that was inhabited by Chinese Catholics and the merchants, the pretty wealthy merchants of Vietnam that were Chinese. They ended up going to a merchant's house to hide there. But what Ngo had done previously was he had set up a phone connection to the palace from this Chinese merchant's house. So when they communicated to the coup believed that they were still, the coup leaders, the generals and the troops, still believed that the Ngo brothers were in the Gia Long Palace, but they weren't. Early in the morning, Diem and Ngo left the house of the Chinese merchant and went to a Chinese Catholic church called St. Francis Xavier. Okay, it still exists down there. And they went into church. This was All Souls Day. This was November 2nd, and people were leaving after a mass. And the Ngo brothers went into the church, received communion, and actually donned priest cassocks, black priest cassocks. Well, Duong Van Minh believed that the Ngo brothers were going to surrender, and he made a big deal of it. He set up at the Joint General Staff headquarters, which was at Consonant Airport. He actually had a table covered with felt. He had the TV coming in, and he was going to go over to the palace, pick up Diem, drive him. In fact, he even went in a sedan, not in a military car, and he was going to take him back to the Joint General Staff headquarters, and he would formally surrender on TV, and then he would be whisked away to a place, another area. Now, what the United States was afraid of was that he could not be put somewhere in Southeast Asia because he would perhaps plot to come back. Again, he had a base of support in South Vietnam. What the United States wanted was for him to be flown to France, if France would accept him. On November 1st, prior to their departure, Ngo Dinh Diem had talked to Henry Cabot Lodge, and Lodge assured him that there would be an airplane. Well, when the Ngo brothers were back to the Chinese merchant, they had called Henry Cabot Lodge and asked about the plane. And Lodge said, well, the only plane that can fly that distance is in Guam, and we can't get it for 24 more hours. Now, what Lodge left out was that ambassadors always had a transport airplane at their disposal, and that Lodge could have taken the Ngo brothers, flown them to the Philippines, and then once they were at the Philippines, the Guam airplane could come in the next day and fly them to France. But at this point, Lodge delayed, and he did not. He simply left it as, we can't get the airplane there for 24 hours to get you out. So Ngo Dinh Diem knew at that point he had no departure from the United States. So what he had to do was to rely on what was going to happen by the coup generals. Well, the generals contacted him, and they urged him to leave the church. And both brothers left the church, and they were pushed into an armored vehicle, what we call an APC, an armored personnel carrier. Their hands were tied behind their back. This was done by a general by the name of My Hao Xuan. Okay, now I'll spell it. It's MAIHUUXUAN. It's My Hao Xuan. The last name is like it rhymes with the word win.
I'm going to stop this sordid story at this point and continue it in the next episode, where Dr. Rodrigues will tell the story of how President Diem was actually murdered. It's a sorry story, and it puts our high and mighty ambassador, Henry Cabot Lodge, in a very poor light. Almost makes you ashamed to be an American when you hear what happened over there. So make sure you tune in and listen to the next episode of this podcast. That'll be episode number 1707. This is Mac Payne here, closing out episode 1706 of the Vietnam Veteran News Podcast. Thank you so much for coming to listen to these stories. I thank Dr. Rodrigues very much for sharing this eye-opening information with us. You are cordially invited to come again soon and often to listen to more coming your way on this podcast, the Vietnam Veteran News.
How about that? Ain't that a mess?